Hello and welcome to a new week in our graduate research and design class. This week is June 20th through the 25th, and we are learning this week about research for establishing cause and effect. So last week was research about trends and correlations, right? We did survey and correlational research. Survey research means that you implement a survey and find out what people think about something or what they feel about different items, or whether they use a certain technology very often or what they experienced in a certain experience. And then correlational research, of course, tries to find trends that relate to items. And so that's an important part of what we're doing in this class, but neither one of those can really lead to cause and effect relationships. So, correlational research can't tell you whether one thing causes another thing or anything like that. So that's what we are moving on to now, is research for establishing cause and effect. We're trying to find out if we can find out what causes something and really make a strong connection between a cause and an effect. So one thing to be aware of, though, is that good researchers, even if they do the strongest type, which is experimental research, even if they do this, they tend to be cautious and tentative in their findings and reporting their findings. They tend to say it may be that this causes this. They don't say that this definitely causes this because of my study. Even if they've done a study that finds a pretty strong causal connection, they don't really tend to report that because they know that maybe another study might come forward in the future that might refute some of their findings, or it might be a little bit different in the way that it approaches the matter. So good researchers are always tentative and always cautious with reporting their results. They don't say, well, any time that this happens, this will always happen. Instead, they say, well, it appears in this study that this caused this. But, there may be future studies that come out that might establish different findings. There might be different populations might not respond the same. There's a lot of things that can change with research. So just be aware of that. So for the chapters this week, you have 3 chapters to read this week. It's quite a load. So chapters 9, 10, and 11. So chapter 9 is on causal comparative research, chapter 10 on experimental research, and chapter 11 on single subject experimental research. You're also going to talk just a little bit about your selecting measuring instruments in the discussion this week. So you're going to look at your own study, and you're going to propose maybe an instrument that you are thinking of using for your own research study. It could be something that you've read about someone else using or something that you will create yourself, but using an already established instrument is usually best because it has been tested and likely validated. So what types of considerations should be made when you select an instrument for a research study is also, a question that you can answer in the research or in the discussion for this week. So just talk a little bit about what kind of instrument you would like to use for your study and what you're thinking about. You don't have to actually post that in your proposal description. That's not part of the proposal description assignment due this week. So it's just part of the research or part of the discussion. Also, you'll take quizzes on those chapters that you read, and then finally you'll submit a proposal description. I wanted to talk just a little bit about some of these different ideas so you get sort of a general view of what they are. Causal comparative research we'll start with here. So I've got all these people on the left and I have people on the right. Causal comparative research is a research study that takes existing groups, and these are, let's pretend this is a group that has received counseling method A, and this is a group that has received counseling method B. What happens with causal comparative research is that you don't actually make them receive those. You can't manipulate who receives what treatment, but you can study groups having already received whatever treatment they already received. So I'll just put a line in between the two. So we can see that this is group A and group B. So let's say you're finding groups that have already received a certain counseling method, and you're comparing them on some measure. And so causal comparative research does this. It finds people who are already in a group before the research study has started, and then it compares them on specific measures of interest. Now for receiving counseling, maybe it's psychological well-being. So you might have causal comparative, or group A, maybe they receive counseling method A, and they seem to have, and you give them a survey, and maybe you do a test with them, and you do the same test and survey with the group B, and then you compare the two. You might say, oh, well, it looks like group A has much higher psychological well-being, or whatever the item that you want to check on is. And so you can conclude maybe that counseling method A seems to be more effective for this population. So that's something to be aware of, is causal comparative research. It's basically taking existing groups of people who've already received some kind of a treatment and comparing them to another group that's already received another treatment of some kind, and seeing which one maybe it comes out better. So that's causal comparative research. And we've had some people do that. We had, for instance, in the past class, a student who did causal comparative research, or proposed anyway to do causal comparative research about their students or teachers who have received mentoring programs versus those who had not, and wanted to compare the ones who had been a part of a mentoring program on retention, if they stayed in their work longer. So that makes sense once you make a causal comparative comparison to find out which group is better, which method of intervention is better. Now the next type of research is actually experimental research. So I'm going to put these all kind of together in one clump. And experimental research means that you can manipulate who goes into what group as a researcher. So you can dictate, you can say, you're going to go in group A, you're going to go in group B. So let me do that as a researcher. Take this one over here as group A. Whoops, that didn't work quite right, but anyway. And we basically randomly assign. It's a random assignment. It has to be random, meaning it has to be by the flip of a coin, or the roll of a dice, or the random picking from a hat. I randomly assign different people to different groups, and this random assignment actually makes my research cause and effect inferences, or if I can say something causes another thing, it makes it much stronger. So let's say these are the two groups. I evenly assign the two groups. I don't know if they're actually even, but anyway. And then I give them another intervention here. Let's do a school one, an educational one. So group A receives project-based learning maybe, and group B receives lecture type instruction after I randomly assign them. Now experimental research means that I did it as a researcher, not that somebody else did it, like maybe the principal assigned students to a class. Well, that's not random assignment, because they assign them themselves, not myself. I didn't assign them as a researcher. So anyway, group A receives project-based learning, group B receives lecture type instruction. And then what I can do is I can measure, after they receive those interventions, I can measure maybe their academic achievement. And let's say that I find that group A actually receives higher academic achievement. Then I can make an inference, basically, and I want to be cautious. Remember, good researchers are always cautious. And I want to be cautious and say, well, it appears that with this group that project-based learning leads to better academic achievement than lecture-based learning. And of course, I want to, again, be cautious. I might say, well, future studies need to be done to establish more of this cause and effect, but I did do random assignment, and so that makes it even stronger. It's not like causal comparative research where the groups were already existing. And so, so that's what this is. Experimental research means that I, as the researcher, can randomly assign the groups, and based on that random assignment, I can make stronger causal inferences, is what it's called. Or I can say strongly that this type of intervention led to greater academic achievement than this one. Or that this type of counseling method led to better psychological well-being than this method. in this study. And I can also, with experimental research, again, we're trying to establish cause and effect, so we can maybe say that in general, maybe this intervention will be better for psychological well-being than this one, even beyond the study. All right, now what's the third one? The third one is single subject experimental research, and this one's kind of a different one. What we're doing here is we're putting all of the people in one group. So they all will receive the same interventions. Let me clump them together again. Here, they're all in the same group, and the group together will all receive the same interventions. But what happens is over time you have different interventions that you will implement, or treatments that you implement, and you measure them over time. So you might implement treatment A on the entire group, which might be a certain, let's go back to counseling, it might be counseling method A, and and then you do a measurement, and you see their psychological well-being. And then you might implement later to the same group counseling method B. And then after that you might measure again their psychological well-being, or whatever you might want to measure. It's whatever item of interest you want to measure. And then you might conclude from that it looks like psychological well-being was better after method A than it was after method B. And so you can make some causal inferences, although this certainly is not as strong as experimental research because it's the same group. And so since they've had method A and B before the end of B, maybe that both of those methods affected their test results in B. Now, the same thing you can do, I did a recent research study like this with a class implementing iPads for reading comprehension. And so what you can do is you can measure, what we did was we measured reading comprehension for several weeks before we came into the class and did any kind of implementation. So it was one class, one fifth grade classroom that we went to, but we got the data from, I think it was 8 weeks before we actually came into the classroom. So we could see what students, data was like before we came into the classroom. And then we came into the classroom with our iPad intervention. And for many weeks, for about 8 weeks after that, we did the iPad interventions. And so, of course, we took the data from that as well. And we were able to compare the pre-data with the post-data. And we did find that there was significant gains in student achievement for reading comprehension when we implemented the iPad activity. So that's a single subject. Now, single subject, don't let that fool you too much. Single subject just basically means single group or one person gets the same intervention. There's even single subject where you just have basically one person in the study. So you could delete all these people and then just have one person and give certain interventions to them. And it's more of an individual type of study as well. So you could again have, let's say, an autistic student, and you might try some behavioral approaches for that autistic student, and then measure, kind of observe their behaviors in the classroom. And then you might try a different kind of behavioral intervention over a few weeks later, and then measure again, and see which one leads to better improvements on behavior for just that one student. So that's also single subject experimental research. Okay, now I'll conclude this morning by talking about the proposal description that's due this week. And I introduced this, I think, a little bit last week, but you're going to include introduction, statement of the problem, review of the literature, and just put your finished preliminary review of the literature there, and then statement of hypothesis. So really there are just 3 sections here that you need to write out this week, and it'll be graded with this research, or with this rubric. And there's an example in the book. You look on page 114, there's some information on what to do for the task, and then there's an example after that. But I've also included another example from a previous student. So notice that he has an introduction introducing this teacher mentoring problem, and does a good job introducing the problem over a page or 2. Then says the statement of problem. Now the statement of problem really talks about this purpose of the study and why we're doing this study. The study investigated the effects of mentoring on new teachers and their attrition rates. And you can even put some literature in there telling me what the problem is that you're trying to solve. And then finally, there's the review of the literature, of course, and then finally there's the statement of a hypothesis, and that is, what do you expect to find as a result of this? study that you want to propose. So that's about it for this week. Have a good week.